And now to some tragic news overnight. Actor Gene Hackman, his wife, classical pianist Betsy Arakawa, and their dog were found dead inside their New Mexico home.
When Gene Hackman died, the world was left with more questions than answers. The legendary actor had lived a private life for years, but even after his death, the mystery surrounding his final days continued to grow. Then, the person responsible for preparing his body finally broke his silence. What the embalmer saw, handled, and experienced during those final hours revealed details that many people never expected to hear. Now, those shocking revelations are bringing new attention to Gene Hackman's final chapter, and some details may leave you speechless. So join us in this video as we reveal the details. The medical examiner's findings reveal Hackman's final days. The medical examiner's findings revealed just how much Gene Hackman's body had been carrying in the years before his death. The report, later obtained by Fox News Digital, documented congestive heart failure, severe kidney damage linked to long-term high blood pressure, and a ventricular pacemaker implanted in April 2019. But perhaps the most unexpected discovery involved his brain. Doctors found changes consistent with advanced Alzheimer's disease, something that had never been publicly known during Hackman's lifetime. The autopsy also showed extensive heart disease caused by plaque buildup and years of high blood pressure. Hackman had already undergone several major heart procedures, including coronary stents, bypass surgery, and an aortic valve replacement. Doctors also found evidence of multiple major heart attacks that had permanently damaged parts of his heart. Then came the brain examination. When specialists studied his brain tissue under a microscope, they confirmed that Hackman was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease. It was a finding that added another layer to the mystery surrounding his final days. But investigators also ruled out some possibilities that had initially attracted attention. Hackman tested negative for hantavirus, while carbon monoxide levels were below 5%, considered within the normal range. That meant two early explanations for the deaths were essentially eliminated. There was, however, one strange detail in the toxicology report. Hackman had 5.3 milligrams per deciliter of acetone in his system. Normally, the level is no more than about 0.3. Acetone can appear naturally in the body during prolonged fasting, certain diabetic complications, or after ingesting rubbing alcohol. In Hackman's case, the medical examiner believed the unusually high level was most consistent with an extended period without food. That quiet finding offered a disturbing glimpse into what his final days may have looked like. Investigators also noted that Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, were found in similar physical conditions.
Cloud of suspicion surrounds the deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
A search warrant affidavit obtained by Fox News Digital described significant decomposition, including facial bloating and early mummification of Arakawa's hands and feet. Hackman's body showed similar changes. Yet, despite the disturbing condition of the scene, officials found no signs of external injuries on either body. There was no evidence of violence or forced entry, just two people who had quietly died, apparently without anyone realizing how much time had passed. But what happened before investigators finally discovered their bodies inside? Keep watching to find out. The day Gene Hackman and Betsy were found. Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, had spent years living a quiet life away from Hollywood. But on February 26th, that privacy came to a disturbing end when the couple was found dead inside their Santa Fe Summit home. Arakawa was 65 years old. Their bodies were discovered alongside one of their dogs, leaving investigators with a mystery that would take time to unravel. According to the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office, the bodies were discovered at around 1:45 p.m. local time. For years, Hackman and Betsy had largely stayed out of the public eye. Their last known public appearance together had been nearly a year earlier, on March 28, 2024, when they were seen having lunch at Papado's Seafood Kitchen in Santa Fe. Hackman was photographed holding onto Betsy's arm as they walked together, a rare glimpse of the couple during their private life. Then, months later, no one could reach them. The sheriff's office told local station KOB4 that officers were eventually dispatched after a neighbor requested a welfare check. But another account later added an unusual detail. Sheriff Aidan Mendoza explained that a pest control worker had gone to the home and received no answer at the door. Concerned, the worker contacted a neighborhood security officer. That security officer then looked through a window and saw the bodies inside before calling emergency services. When investigators arrived, the scene immediately raised questions about how long the couple had been dead. One day after the discovery, Mendoza appeared on the Today Show and admitted that building an exact timeline would be difficult. Based on the condition of the bodies and other evidence, investigators believed Hackman and Betsy had probably been dead for several days, possibly even a couple of weeks. But there was one piece of evidence that eventually helped narrow things down. Hackman had a pacemaker, and its stored data later showed that his heart had stopped on February 17th. That meant he had been dead for 9 days before his body was discovered. Suddenly, the timeline became even more unsettling. The bigger question was what had happened to Betsy and when she had died. Mendoza explained that investigators could not immediately determine whether the couple had died at the same time or whether one had survived the other for days. There were no obvious signs that anyone had been moving around the house after the deaths, making the timeline even harder to establish. Their bodies were found in separate rooms. Hackman was discovered near the kitchen, while Betsy was found inside a bathroom. And there was one more heartbreaking detail. Of the couple's 3 dogs, 2 survived. That meant that while Hackman and Betsy remained inside their home for days, life had continued quietly around them, with 2 of their dogs still alive. For investigators, every small detail mattered, because the house had become the only place where the final chapter of their lives could be pieced together. Who was Gene Hackman before Hollywood knew his name? Stay tuned to find out. Before the fame, the struggle that built Gene Hackman. Long before Gene Hackman became one of Hollywood's most respected actors, his life was shaped by hardship, rejection, and a determination that refused to disappear. Born Eugene Allen Hackman on January 30th, 1930, in San Bernardino, California, he grew up in a family that moved frequently. His mother, Anna, was a Canadian-born actress, painter, pianist, and waitress, while his father, Eugene Sr., worked the printing press for a local newspaper. Hackman also had a brother named Richard. Eventually, the family settled in Danville, Illinois, where they lived with Hackman's English-born grandmother, Beatrice. Even as a child, Hackman seemed drawn toward acting. He later recalled deciding that he wanted to become an actor when he was just 10 years old. But his childhood was far from stable. When Hackman was 13, his father divorced his mother and left the family. Just a few years later, Hackman made a decision that would take his life in an entirely different direction. At 16, he left home and lied about his age so he could join the U.S. Marine Corps. He spent 4.5 years in the Marines as a field radio operator. During his service, he was stationed in China, including Qingdao and Shanghai, as part of Operation Beleaguer. After communist forces took control of mainland China in 1949, he was reassigned to Hawaii and Japan. He was eventually discharged in 1951. After leaving the Marines, Hackman moved to New York City and worked different jobs while trying to figure out what came next. He briefly studied journalism and television production at the University of Illinois under the GI Bill, but he left before completing his degree and eventually returned to California. Then came another painful loss. In 1962, his mother died in a fire she accidentally started while smoking. By that point, however, Hackman had already begun chasing the dream he had carried since childhood. He started seriously pursuing acting in 1956 and joined the Pasadena Playhouse. There, he met another struggling young actor named Dustin Hoffman. Neither man looked like a future Hollywood star. In fact, their classmates voted Hackman and Hoffman as the 2 students least likely to succeed. Hackman even received one of the lowest scores the Pasadena Playhouse had ever given an actor. But instead of walking away, he took the rejection personally and used it as fuel. Hackman eventually returned to New York, where he and Hoffman struggled to survive while chasing acting jobs. They were part of a group of young actors who could barely pay the bills, sometimes sharing apartments and taking whatever work they could find. Hackman worked at Howard Johnson's between acting jobs. At one point, an instructor from the Pasadena Playhouse encountered him working at the restaurant and reportedly told him that the job proved he would never amount to anything. Even a Marine officer, who once saw him working as a doorman, insulted him. But Hackman remembered those words. Instead of allowing them to end his career before it began, he turned the rejection into motivation. He later explained that the struggle itself became part of what kept him going. For Hackman, getting an audition, landing a role, and proving people wrong became almost an obsession. His persistence eventually began to pay off. He performed in off-Broadway productions before making his Broadway debut in 1963. The following year, his appearance in Any Wednesday became a major Broadway success and helped open the door to film work. His early movie roles were small, but they slowly put his name in front of Hollywood audiences. Then, in 1967, everything changed. Hackman was cast as Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and finally gave audiences a glimpse of the actor he could become. From being told he would never amount to anything to earning an Oscar nomination, Hackman had spent more than a decade fighting for his chance. And that struggle was only the beginning of the career that would eventually make him a Hollywood legend. How did that relentless struggle turn Hackman into a Hollywood legend? Let's find out. From Hollywood stardom to an unforgettable legacy. After years of struggling for even the smallest acting opportunities, Gene Hackman had finally reached the point where Hollywood could no longer ignore him. His breakthrough in Bonnie and Clyde had earned him his first Oscar nomination, but the best was still ahead. In 1970, Hackman received another Academy Award nomination for his role in I Never Sang for My Father, where he played a son struggling to communicate with his difficult father. His performance opposite Melvyn Douglas was praised for feeling natural, almost as though viewers were watching a real family conflict unfold. Then came the role that changed everything. In 1971, Hackman played New York City detective Jimmy "Popeye" Doyle in The French Connection. The gritty crime film, directed by William Friedkin, turned Hackman into a genuine star. He played Doyle as tough, exhausted, impatient, and completely believable. Instead of presenting a polished Hollywood hero, Hackman gave audiences a character who looked and acted like a real man, worn down by the job. The performance earned him his first Academy Award for Best Actor. Suddenly, the actor who had once been told he would never amount to anything was one of the biggest names in Hollywood. And Hackman did not slow down. Over the next 3 years, he appeared in 10 films, making him one of the busiest actors in the industry. He moved between crime movies, dramas, thrillers, comedies, and action films without allowing himself to become trapped in one type of role. He starred in Cisco Pike, Prime Cut, and The Poseidon Adventure. Then came Scarecrow in 1973, where he starred opposite Al Pacino. The film became a favorite of Hackman's and went on to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. In 1974, he showed another side of himself in Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation. Hackman played a surveillance expert who becomes increasingly troubled by what he hears during his work. The film earned multiple Oscar nominations and also won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. But that same year, Hackman surprised audiences in a completely different way. He played Harold, the blind man, in Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein. The role showed that the intense actor from The French Connection also had a sharp comedic side. Hackman continued taking on challenging roles throughout the 1970s. He returned as Popeye Doyle in French Connection 2, appeared in Night Moves, and took roles in films such as A Bridge Too Far and March or Die. Then came one of his most recognizable characters. In 1978, Hackman played the criminal mastermind Lex Luthor in Superman the Movie, opposite Christopher Reeve. Rather than making Luthor completely ridiculous, Hackman gave the character a playful personality while keeping him dangerous. His performance became so memorable that he returned for Superman 2 and later Superman 4. The Quest for Peace. The 1980s brought even more variety. Hackman moved between leading and supporting roles, appearing in Reds, Eureka, Under Fire, Uncommon Valor, Power, and Hoosiers. In Hoosiers, he played a high school basketball coach, giving another grounded performance that audiences remembered long after the movie ended. He also continued appearing in major productions such as No Way Out, Split Decisions, and Bat 21. By the end of the decade, Hackman had become one of Hollywood's most dependable performers. His performance in Mississippi Burning in 1988 showed exactly why. Playing an FBI agent investigating the assassinations of 3 civil rights activists, Hackman brought a quiet intensity to the role. He earned another Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, although he lost the award to Dustin Hoffman. Then, in 1992, came another performance that would become part of his legacy. Hackman played the brutal sheriff Little Bill Daggett in Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. The role was far removed from the heroic characters audiences might have expected from him. Little Bill was cruel, violent, and completely willing to abuse his power. Hackman had previously tried to avoid violent roles, but Eastwood convinced him to take the part. It proved to be the right decision. Hackman won his second Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, while Unforgiven also won Best Picture.
For Best Picture, the nominee Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood, producer. And the Oscar for the Best Picture of 1992 goes to Clint Eastwood.
Throughout the 1990s, Hackman continued proving that he could fit almost anywhere. He appeared in The Firm alongside Tom Cruise, played a death row prisoner in The Chamber, and later appeared in Runaway Jury. He also starred in Crimson Tide with Denzel Washington, played a film producer in Get Shorty, and showed his comedic side again in The Birdcage. He reunited with Clint Eastwood in Absolute Power, worked with Paul Newman in Twilight, voiced a villain in Ants, and appeared opposite Will Smith in Enemy of the State. That last role even carried echoes of his character from The Conversation. By the end of the decade, Hackman had done something very few actors ever manage. He had remained relevant across generations without depending on one type of character. He had played heroes, villains, detectives, criminals, fathers, coaches, military officers, comedians, and complicated men who could not easily be classified.
Well, I like to think of myself as a craftsman, coming prepared, knowing exactly what I want to do, and then being willing to change.
A two-time Academy Award winner, Hackman's artistry extended far beyond the screen.
And even after decades in Hollywood, Gene Hackman still had more stories left to tell. But after becoming a legend, what finally made Hackman leave Hollywood behind? Keep watching to find out. The final chapter: Why Gene Hackman Walked Away from Hollywood. As Gene Hackman entered the 2000s, he was already a Hollywood legend. But instead of slowing down, he continued taking on roles that showed just how much range he still had. He appeared alongside Morgan Freeman in Under Suspicion, Keanu Reeves in The Replacements, Owen Wilson in Behind Enemy Lines, and Sigourney Weaver in Heartbreakers. He also starred in David Mamet's crime thriller Heist, playing an aging professional thief who is forced into what may be his final job. But one of his most memorable late-career performances came in 2001. In Wes Anderson's The Royal Tenenbaums, Hackman stepped into a very different kind of role. He played Royal Tenenbaum, the strange and selfish head of a wealthy but deeply troubled family. Royal was manipulative, dishonest, and often difficult to like, but Hackman also gave him warmth and vulnerability. Critics loved the performance. Hackman earned the Golden Globe Award for Best Actor in a Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy, proving once again that even after decades in the business, he could surprise audiences. In 2003, Hackman finally shared the screen with someone who had been part of his life since his struggling days: Dustin Hoffman. The two old friends appeared together in Runaway Jury, a John Grisham legal thriller. Decades earlier, they had been young actors struggling to get noticed. Now, they were established stars working together on a major film. It was a fitting moment. But Hackman's time in front of the camera was almost over. In 2004, he appeared alongside Ray Romano in Welcome to Mooseport. It would become his final acting role in a feature film. That same year, Hackman spoke openly about his future during a rare interview with Larry King. He revealed that he had no new film projects planned and believed his acting career was finished. For an actor who had spent nearly 5 decades working, the decision was significant. By 2008, Hackman made his retirement official. He explained that a major factor had been a medical stress test he underwent in New York. His doctor warned him that his heart was not in the condition it should be for that level of stress. Hackman listened. He had spent his entire career pushing himself, but now he wanted something different. When GQ asked him in 2011 whether he would ever consider returning for one final movie, Hackman did not completely close the door. He said he might consider it if he could make the film at his own home, without having to deal with a large production around him. But realistically, his acting career was over. Instead of returning to Hollywood, Hackman found another way to tell stories. He became a novelist. Working with undersea archaeologist Daniel Lenihan, he wrote several historical fiction books. Their first collaboration, Wake of the Perdido Star, was released in 1999 and followed a young man on a 19th-century sea adventure. They later wrote Justice for None, a Depression-era assassination story inspired by a real crime from Hackman's childhood hometown of Danville, Illinois. Their third collaboration, Escape from Andersonville, explored a prison escape during the American Civil War. Hackman eventually began writing on his own as well. His first solo novel, Payback at Morning Peak, was released in 2011. It was a story of love and revenge set in the American Old West. 2 years later, he published Pursuit, a police thriller that became his final novel. Even after leaving acting behind, Hackman never completely disappeared from storytelling. So while Hollywood eventually lost Gene Hackman as an actor, he never stopped creating. He simply moved into a quieter life, away from cameras, premieres, and constant public attention. And that decision would make what happened in his final years even more difficult for the public to understand. After leaving Hollywood behind, how did the world remember Gene Hackman? Let's find out. Hollywood says goodbye to a true acting legend. When news of Gene Hackman's death spread, the reaction from Hollywood was immediate. Actors, directors, and filmmakers who had worked with him began remembering not only the roles he played, but the person they knew behind the camera. Clint Eastwood, who directed Hackman in Unforgiven and Absolute Power, described him as one of the finest actors he had ever known. Eastwood praised Hackman's intense and instinctive style, saying he never gave a false performance. But his words became even more personal when he described Hackman as a dear friend, whom he would deeply miss. That sentiment was shared by Francis Ford Coppola, who directed Hackman in The Conversation. Coppola remembered him as a great actor whose work was both inspiring and magnificent. He also praised the complexity Hackman brought to his characters and said his death was a loss worth mourning, while his life and contribution deserved to be celebrated. Then came one of the most emotional tributes. At the 97th Academy Awards, Morgan Freeman took a moment to remember Hackman.
So I think I speak for us all when I say, Gene, you'll be remembered for that and for so much more. Rest in peace, my friend.
The two actors had worked together, and Freeman spoke about what it was like to share a scene with him. Freeman described Hackman as a generous performer whose talent did not simply make him look good. Instead, Hackman had a way of making everyone around him better. That may have been one of the greatest compliments an actor could receive. Hackman's influence stretched across generations. Dustin Hoffman, Glenn Close, Tom Hanks, Viola Davis, Bill Murray, Mel Brooks, Alec Baldwin, Gwyneth Paltrow, Barbara Streisand, Nathan Lane, Josh Brolin, John Cusack, Ben Stiller, and Antonio Banderas were among the many other stars who paid tribute to him. Each came from a different part of Hollywood, but their messages carried a similar idea. Hackman mattered. He was not simply famous because he had won 2 Academy Awards or appeared in dozens of major films. His influence came from the way he worked. He could walk into a scene and make it feel completely real. He could play a hero without making the character perfect, or a villain without turning him into a cartoon. He made complicated people feel human. Film critic Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian went even further, describing Hackman's death as the end of an era in American cinema. He connected Hackman to the American New Wave, a period when filmmakers and actors began creating grittier, more realistic movies. For Bradshaw, Hackman had something that could not easily be copied. His face was not the typical polished Hollywood face. It was weathered, intelligent, tough, and sometimes almost intimidating. Yet that same face could suddenly show warmth, sadness, or pain. That ability made him unforgettable. And perhaps that is why so many people reacted so strongly when he died. Gene Hackman had spent decades playing characters audiences could believe in. Long after his retirement, those performances remained alive through the films he left behind. Now, with his death, the people who knew him were not simply saying goodbye to an actor. They were saying goodbye to someone who had changed what a Hollywood actor could be. After Hollywood said goodbye, what truth was still waiting to emerge? Stay tuned to find out. the truth behind the mystery finally comes into focus. It is worth asking why Gene Hackman's death attracted so much attention in the first place. Celebrity deaths happen all the time, and most disappear from the headlines within a few days. But this case was different. Part of the reason was the strange set of circumstances. Hackman was found dead in his home during the same week as his much younger wife, Betsy Arakawa. They were discovered in separate rooms, and at first, investigators did not have an obvious explanation for what had happened. Then there was Hackman himself. For nearly 6 decades, he had been one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. Millions of people knew his voice, his face, and his most famous characters. But knowing Gene Hackman, the actor, was very different from knowing Gene Hackman, the person. He had spent much of his later life away from the spotlight. Friends described him as guarded, while people who worked with him often remembered an actor who could completely disappear into a character. Then, when the cameras stopped rolling, he could retreat from public attention just as quickly. That made the circumstances of his death even more unsettling. A man who had spent his entire career being watched had somehow become almost invisible in his final years. So when he died under circumstances that were initially difficult to explain, people naturally wanted answers. And that uncertainty created room for theories. Early on, carbon monoxide poisoning seemed like an obvious possibility. 2 people were found dead inside the same home, there were no obvious signs of violence, and investigators had not yet pieced together the timeline. Then hantavirus entered the conversation. Because the disease was relatively unusual and unfamiliar to many people, it quickly became a subject of speculation. Online discussions grew, and theories spread before investigators had all the answers. But later findings changed the picture. Hackman tested negative for hantavirus, and his carbon monoxide level was below 5%, well within the normal range. Those results removed 2 theories that had received significant attention in the early stages of the investigation. Then there was the acetone. The toxicology report showed that Hackman had an unusually high level of acetone in his system. On its own, that number sounded alarming. But when medical examiners considered the finding in context, it pointed towards something far more tragic than sinister. The elevated acetone level was considered most consistent with an extended period without food. That detail quietly suggested what Hackman's final days may have been like. An elderly man with serious heart problems and advanced Alzheimer's disease was apparently alone in the house after Betsy had died. The person who would normally have been there to care for him was no longer able to do so. There was no dramatic conspiracy hiding behind the number. There was simply a deeply sad possibility. Hackman may have been alive for days without fully understanding what had happened around him, while his physical condition continued to deteriorate. And that is what makes the final explanation so difficult to accept. There is no perfect Hollywood ending here. No secret villain, no shocking confession, no single revelation that suddenly explains everything. Instead, the truth emerged slowly through medical reports, toxicology results, investigators' observations, and the evidence left behind inside a quiet Santa Fe home. What eventually came into focus was a much more human story. There was an elderly man whose heart was failing and whose brain was affected by advanced Alzheimer's disease. There was a wife who had been dealing with her own health concerns before her death. In a strange way, even the story of his death followed a pattern that had defined his life. It did not unfold the way people expected. There was no sensational ending waiting behind the door. There was no dramatic final twist. Instead, the truth arrived slowly, and it was much quieter than the rumors. It came through evidence, through the medical examiner's findings, through the pacemaker data, through toxicology, and ultimately through the person whose job was to look closely enough to separate what actually happened from what people only imagined had happened. For Gene Hackman, the final chapter was not the mystery many first believed it to be. It was something far more heartbreaking, the story of a legendary actor whose final days passed quietly, with the truth only becoming clear after he was gone. So, what do you think about Gene Hackman's death? Let us know in the comments section below. In the end, Gene Hackman's final chapter was filled with unanswered questions, heartbreaking discoveries, and a truth that emerged slowly. His legacy, however, remains timeless. Like, subscribe, and join us for more untold stories.